Cowardly cop humiliates an elderly black woman, only to discover she is an FBI agent. If you're new to this channel, I invite you to click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any amazing new stories here. Jennifer has spent most of her life in England. She lived in very large and beautiful houses that her father, because of his work, was able to afford. He never had to worry about the parts that made the machine that brought him money work. She just ate the fruit, no questions asked. Now, at the age of 40, after much that had happened and affected her greatly, she decided to start a new life in the United States. Her new home in Philadelphia was a large, modern, and simple house. It fitted in very well with the image of a strong woman that Jennifer wanted to show. It was, in many ways, a new beginning. On the first night in her new home, when Jennifer looked out of the window, she saw something that made her uncomfortable. Across the street, there was a simple, well-kept house that belonged to Susan. She was a black woman of 64. There was nothing different about that house. The woman who lived there was normal too. Susan had lived in that neighborhood for over 30 years. Her house, simple but welcoming, showed what you were like: strong, durable, and full of memories. At 59, your dark, scarred skin showed that you had been through many struggles. But it also showed the honor of someone who has faced each one of them without shrinking back. Susan, who used to work for the FBI, always stood out for being very intelligent and for having a strong spirit. She was very proud of these qualities. She wasn't the type of person to accept wrongdoing. She didn't bow down to anyone either. Susan had a good relationship with her neighbors. They respected each other. Everyone knew that, behind her serious and quiet appearance, there was a woman with a strong character, but also kindness. She helped out whenever she had the chance. She was always willing to listen and give advice. This was especially true for the younger members of the neighborhood, who saw her as a mother. Her son, Tyler, who is 34, was the main source of her happiness. He did mechanic work. He repaired old cars. It was a passion he picked up from his grandfather. Mother and son were an unbreakable combination. Even though she had a quiet life, Susan was never the type to be fooled by what appeared to be. She had already observed the world when she was an agent. She knew a lot about power games and the traps that lay in people's attitudes. That's why, as soon as Jennifer moved in next door, Susan felt a little uneasy. There was something in her new neighbor's gaze that made Jennifer uncomfortable. It was the way the neighbor, with her proud and distant manner, seemed to care about no one and nothing. For the first few days, Susan wasn't too worried. Everyone has their own way, she thought. But it soon became clear that Jennifer's presence would bring more than just discomfort. Jennifer hardly ever left the house. When she did, she didn't want to have any contact with the neighbors. He didn't say hello. He didn't look at people. It seemed that everyone around him didn't exist. But Jennifer's eyes were always alert, peering out from behind the curtains of the big house. Susan felt as if someone was looking at her, and that bothered her. She understood what it meant to be watched, and that made her wary. Tyler noticed that Jennifer was acting strangely. He came home late. He was dirty with grease and tired from working in the garage. His job as a mechanic was easy, but honest. He would buy used cars that nobody else wanted and spend months calmly fixing them up. Susan always said that Tyler had amazing hands because he could change parts into something else. His way of noticing details in machines was very good. But Jennifer didn't see it that way. To her, Tyler was just a black man walking home at night. That was enough to make her suspicious of him. Susan realized that Jennifer was racist. It wasn't said outright, but it was evident. It was the way Jennifer always left the doors locked and the windows closed. It seemed that she was afraid. It was a fear without reason, but Susan understood that the marks of prejudice were great. It was often a lack of knowledge that made people feel hatred. She hoped it wouldn't get worse, but deep down she knew that sooner or later a confrontation would happen. Susan had been in a situation like this before, but she never thought it would happen in her own home, with her own neighbor. The days went by, and Jennifer seemed to be getting further away every day. Susan quickly saw the woman watching every move next door. Tyler started talking to his mother about the feeling of being watched. Susan just shook her head, as if she already knew what was going to happen. A few days later, Jennifer picked up the phone and called the city police. In a quiet, almost emotionless voice, she made the report. He said he had seen strange things in the house next door. He thought that Susan and Tyler were involved in selling forbidden things. He said, without thinking twice, that Susan's son seemed to be buying cars that were stolen. He dismantled these cars and sold the parts. Jennifer knew she was telling the truth. She knew she had no proof to back up what she was saying, but that made no difference. She just wished they would go away. The words came out of her mouth easily, almost as if they were true. Deep down, Jennifer knew she had no real reason to distrust Susan, but her racism made her think that her complaint was right. For her, her experiences in Manchester were proof that any black person near her was a threat. Susan and Tyler never did anything to bother her, but for Jennifer, just their presence near her home was reason to act. On the other end of the line, the police officers listened carefully. Jennifer's complaints could not be ignored, even without evidence. She recounted in detail the strange activities that seemed to be happening at Susan's house. She saw the cars going in and out of Tyler's garage. She also noticed the low conversations between him and the customers in the garage. In addition, she said that Susan was a very quiet woman and always seemed to be hiding something. With this invented description, Jennifer showed a picture of a family that was involved in crime. In reality, Susan and Tyler were just living their lives quietly. What she couldn't imagine, however, were the very bad effects this accusation would have. For Jennifer, it was just an easy way to resolve her unease. She wasn't worried about what would happen to Susan or Tyler. For her, they were problems that needed to be solved. The law was just an easy way to help with that. A few hours later, the confusion began. Sirens went off in the neighborhood. The sound of police cars pulling up in front of Susan's house suddenly took the calm out of the neighborhood. Police officers with heavy weapons got out of their cars. They were in a hurry because of the report that had taken place. What Jennifer said about Susan and Tyler's possible connection to the crime made the police act quickly and firmly. They went straight to Susan's house. They didn't ask questions or try to understand the situation better. They were ready to face whatever came their way. Susan was in her kitchen making breakfast. She heard the sound of police sirens and felt her heart beat faster. She looked out of the window and saw the police surrounding her house. Something wasn't right. She couldn't think what had happened, but she knew it wasn't a friendly visit. The intuition she had acquired during her years in the FBI warned her of the danger that was coming. Susan ran to the front door. She wanted to protect her home. But before she could do anything, she heard the sound of wood being broken. The police opened the door with force and rushed in, armed. Susan paused for a moment. She was surprised by the violence of the invasion. She knew that the police couldn't enter her house without a special request. But there they were, breaking down her door and entering her place. The head of the operation was Roger. He was a big, strong man. Roger was known for being rude. He asked Susan to stay in place and keep her hands to herself. Anger began to rise inside her. "Who do you think you are to come into my house like that?" she asked, looking at Roger face to face. But Roger, who was very arrogant, didn't want to hear any explanations. He didn't listen to what Susan said, believing that he was in charge of everything. He didn't look her in the eye. With contempt, he said, "I'm in charge here, ma'am. Now you're going to be quiet, or you're going to feel bad about it." To him, Susan was just a boring woman, and Tyler, her son, was just a possible criminal, even if he had no proof. He didn't need permission or justification. In Roger's world, power and strength meant justice. Susan felt the shame and anger rising inside her, but she didn't give in. "You can't come into my house without permission. Leave now, or I'll make you never wear that badge again," she said, her voice sounding as strong as a knife cutting through the air. Roger, who was used to dealing with people who didn't want to accept it, smiled sideways. But the anger in his eyes was easy to see. He used to manipulate people. He used his power to frighten and dominate. Susan, but she was no ordinary woman. But before she could say any more, Roger asked his men to go ahead. The tension was clear. Susan felt the pressure of oppression bearing down on her, but she wouldn't give up. She moved quickly and picked up a drawer next to her. Inside was a gun she'd had since her days in the FBI. He pointed it at Roger. His hand was steady, and his eyes were full of anger. "You can only come in here with a permit from the judge. I know the law, and I'm not going to let you come into my house like I'm a bandit," he shouted, with a lot of anger in his voice. The room fell silent for a moment. The police officers, who had been very confident, became doubtful. The situation was nervous. Every second seemed to last a long time. Roger, however, wasn't ready to back down. He understood that Susan was special, but his pride and his desire to be in charge were greater. He stared at her, as if to challenge her with his gaze. "Do you think you're the only one who knows the law, ma'am?" "Put that gun down before you really regret it," he said, his words full of menace. But Susan wasn't easily frightened. She thought for a moment about her choices. She knew she was in a bad situation, but she also knew that accepting that abuse of power would be like betraying all her beliefs. The pressure in the room was almost too much. Roger had his men ready and waiting for an order. He was preparing to act. It was at that moment that the sound of more police cars arriving outside broke the silence. Support had arrived. Susan, knowing that she was in a difficult situation, continued with her gun drawn. She knew the situation was going to get worse from that moment on, but she also knew that she couldn't let her home be invaded like this. Roger, now with more men to help him, felt totally in charge. He took a step forward, showing that he was done talking. The policeman moved towards Susan, and even with all her experience, she was quickly controlled. Her gun was taken from her hands, and her hands were bound tightly. She was pulled out of the house, while the neighbors looked on with curiosity and fear. Susan was very ashamed and angry. She couldn't understand what was happening. As a former FBI agent, I knew my rights. I knew the police couldn't do that. But there she was, with her hands tied and being treated like a person who had committed a crime. Outside, more police cars were parked, blocking the street. Susan, who was now sitting on the floor, watched helplessly as Roger sent his men to search every part of her house. She knew there was nothing wrong there. But she also understood that anything they found, however small, would be used against her and Tyler. When Roger left the house with documents and car parts from Tyler's garage, Susan felt her heart heavy. This wasn't fair. It was a trap. As soon as she was loaded into the car, Susan heard the sound of another car coming close by. Tyler was quickly called away from his work. He didn't know exactly what was going on. He stopped the truck in front of the house. When he got out, he saw his mother wearing handcuffs and surrounded by police officers. She was surprised on the spot. "Mom! What's going on here?" he shouted as he ran towards her. But Roger and another policeman quickly stopped him. "Stay there, kid. This is a police action. We need to talk to you too." Tyler was confused and very angry. He tried to talk, but Roger wouldn't change his mind. "You're her son, aren't you? You're facing difficulties. We've received a complaint about you and your mother. Now keep quiet, or the situation will get worse." Susan was very angry to see her son being treated like this. Tyler had nothing to do with this mess. Seeing him pulled into a situation that wasn't fair was very hard to bear. But the situation soon got worse. The police, led by Roger, began searching Tyler's garage. There, Tyler kept old cars that he was repairing. For him, every piece of metal and every dismantled engine was part of a serious job. He kept himself going by repairing old cars and selling the parts he no longer used. But for Roger, this was the perfect opportunity to reinforce his accusations. "These cars here," said Roger with an evil smile, "look very strange. We need to take all this to the police station." Susan, upon hearing this, began to protest. "Those cars belong to Tyler. He does this kind of work. He's a mechanic. There's nothing wrong here. You're making a big mistake." Roger didn't care about the truth. From the moment he entered that house, he had already decided that he was going to find something to blame Susan and her son for. He liked to feel that he had control and power because of his uniform. That morning, he was determined to use it to the full. Roger, without waiting, had Tyler arrested with handcuffs as well. Tyler tried to explain that all the papers on the cars were correct and that he had a real business. However, no one listened to what he said. "You can tell this at the police station," said Roger coldly, as two policemen held Tyler down and put the handcuffs on him. Susan, who had already got out of the car, watched the scene unfold as if it were a nightmare. Her son, who had worked honestly all his life, was being taken into custody as if he were a criminal. She understood that it all came from Jennifer's lie and her neighbor's unjust accusation. Roger, with his bossy manner and bad intentions, was just taking the chance to make himself feel better than the others. Susan felt helpless at the moment, but her anger continued to build. She knew the rules and believed that somehow she could change this unfair situation. When they arrived at the police station, Susan and Tyler were put in different rooms. They were each in an interrogation room. The deputy who attended to them looked tired. He seemed to have faced many situations like this before. In these situations, the truth was changed by the actions of people who had a lot of power. But Susan, again, didn't want to be quiet. "I was an FBI agent," she said, looking at the deputy. "You just broke into my house without a warrant. I want to know who made this false report against us." The deputy, upon hearing Susan's name and her former position, seemed to doubt it for a moment. He knew he was talking to a person who knew the rules of law. After a short pause, he finally told the truth. "A neighbor of yours reported it. There was a woman by the name of Jennifer." Susan felt her stomach tighten. Jennifer. It had certainly been her. The woman who had arrived with her prejudice and arrogance and wouldn't accept having a black family as neighbors. At that moment, Susan felt the pain of injustice hit her. Jennifer not only told lies, but also made changes to the whole system so that the police would be aggressive towards her and her son. And the saddest thing of all was seeing Tyler, arrested and charged with a crime he didn't do, because of a mistake that should never have happened. Susan understood that she had to fight for justice. She also realized that this fight was just beginning. At that moment, something inside her began to glow. Susan is not the kind of person who accepts losing without a fight. Now, with Jennifer's name in her mind as the cause of all the trouble, she began to think about how to get revenge. The meeting with Roger and what Jennifer had told her were just the beginning of a more complicated story. Susan knew she would need all her strength and intelligence to defend her name and Tyler's. She looked at the deputy one more time. His voice was firm and resolute. "It's not going to end this way. You've chosen the right person to mess with." At the police station, after what seemed like a very long time, the deputy came into the room. "It's Susan, right?" The deputy began to speak, his arms crossed on the cold metal table. Susan looked at him carefully and didn't look away. "Yes, it's me. Today you made a big mistake. You broke into my house without permission and arrested my son on a false charge. I want to understand what's going on here." The delegate was in doubt for a moment. He knew that the operation had been carried out because of a complaint, but he also knew that, because of Susan's experience, she wouldn't accept any simple explanation. He turned over some sheets of paper in front of him. After a moment's silence, he replied, "Someone made a report about strange things happening in your house, Susan. A neighbor said you were selling things that weren't legal. She said that your son, Tyler, is taking part in buying and selling cars that have been stolen." Susan took a deep breath. She was trying to control the anger inside her. She understood that this story was made up, a heavy lie that wanted to hurt her and her son. But the most important thing at that moment was to know who the person was who had set this trap. Who made such a strange accusation? Her voice was strong and powerful. The deputy, seeing that there was no longer any way to hide the truth, began to speak slowly. He seemed to think that what he was about to say might cause even more surprise. "It was your neighbor. Her name is Jennifer." Susan closed her eyes for a quick moment. She felt that her idea was right. This idea had been bothering her ever since the police broke into her house. Jennifer, that proud woman who had just moved into the neighborhood, had a way of thinking she was better than everyone else. Susan didn't talk to her much, but it was enough to realize the venomous prejudice coming from her. Now everything was clear. The hatred Jennifer harbored inside her came out in a very cruel way. She made a false complaint. This complaint was based on racial prejudice and a desire to drive away people she felt shouldn't be around. "I'm sorry, I can't help with that." "Jennifer," muttered Susan, her voice low but full of disdain. Of course it came from her. The deputy, seeing how serious the situation was, tried to explain why the police had acted that way. "Look, Susan, the complaint was important. When a person tells us about crimes, especially about cars that have been stolen, we need to investigate." He shook his head, looking uncomfortable with his explanation. "I understand that the situation was difficult, but we followed the rules as we were told." Susan, however, had no interest in the explanations. Did you know that the system often made quick decisions about black people? This was especially the case when the complaint came from someone who looked like and had Jennifer's status. Susan understood that the law was often used to control people. Now, more than before, she felt how true that was. She looked at the deputy without looking away and without blinking. And now what? What do I do now that my son is in jail and my house is a mess? The deputy turned over a few more sheets and coughed a little. Your son Tyler is being kept for a while. We saw that there were some cars in the garage that didn't have the right documents. That raises questions. I'm not saying they're stolen, but we should do an investigation. He'll stay here until we can check the information. Susan felt as if something was gripping her stomach. She knew Tyler wasn't to blame. The cars he owned were nice, even if they were old and had papers that needed fixing. He wasn't a person who committed crimes, but now he was trapped in a system that had difficulty knowing what was right or wrong. This ended up causing more suffering. She understood that Jennifer's complaint, even if she wasn't right, had created a serious problem. This is very unfair, Susan said. You're ruining my son's life because of a woman who is a racist and a liar. Jennifer acted this way because she doesn't like the idea of having a black family living near her. You are agreeing with this lack of justice. The deputy looked down. He was visibly upset by the accusation. He knew that Susan was right in her doubts about why Jennifer acted the way she did. But the system was difficult and followed its own rules. Let's do what we can to look at everything as fairly as we can, Susan. I understand that you're frustrated, but do you understand? Susan stopped talking. Her voice was loud and very angry. Do you really know what it's like to have someone break into your house, to have your child arrested, all because of a lie involving racism? I worked for the FBI for many years. I know the law better than anyone else here. It's not fair here. It's misusing power. And I'm going to make them all pay for it. The deputy let out a deep sigh. He realized that he had nothing to say to calm Susan's anger. He was sure the fight wasn't over yet. After leaving the police station, Susan didn't go home. He couldn't imagine what it would be like to return to his own home. This place, which had been so familiar and safe, now seemed to be hit by the violence and disrespect he had faced. She decided to go to Jennifer's house. She wanted to confront the woman who had completely changed her life. The walk to the house next door was quick, but with every step, it felt like I was carrying the weight of a long journey. When she arrived at the entrance to the beautiful modern house, Susan didn't think twice. He closed his fists around the wood of the door and knocked hard. The sound resounded in the quiet house, and for a brief instant, time seemed to stand still. Susan knew this confrontation was going to happen. She usually liked to resolve things calmly and logically, but at that moment, she no longer had the patience. The door opened slowly. Jennifer appeared wearing a beautiful silk robe. His eyes met Susan's with surprise, but without fear. Jennifer was a woman who didn't believe that what she was doing could bring results. For her, her position and her money kept her safe from any revenge. When Jennifer saw Susan, her expression quickly changed from surprise to disdain. Susan, she said in a calm, cold voice, why are you here? Susan acted quickly. Her whole body was shaking with anger, but her voice came out strong and sure. I'm sure it was you. You were the person who made that false complaint. Because of that, my son is in prison. I'm not here to listen to your lies. I want to understand why you did it. Jennifer crossed her arms and lifted her chin as if she were thinking of herself. She didn't seem to be affected by Susan's accusations. In fact, there was a gleam of happiness in her eyes, as if she had gotten everything she wanted. I don't have to explain anything to you, Susan. I did what I thought was important to take care of my home and my life. And to be honest, I wish you and your son were arrested. You, the way you are, shouldn't live near me. The silence that followed was very strong. Jennifer's words hung in the air like a knife, removing any hint of politeness that might still have existed between them. Susan was very angry and clenched her hands at her sides. But she knew that being out of control at that moment would please Jennifer, which was exactly what she wanted. However, the clear racism and unrepentant malice seemed to be a final appearance blow. You accused me because we're black, right? Susan said something, which sounded more like a statement than a question. Jennifer didn't say anything straight away. However, the sarcastic smile that appeared on her lips was enough for Susan to understand. Would you like to know what I think of you? Jennifer finally said. She said it in a voice full of anger. I spent many years in Manchester. I was mugged and became afraid of people like you. Black-skinned men. You all look alike. I don't trust you. When I saw who my neighbors were, I realized I had to take action. I'm not going to let people like you ruin my peace of mind." Susan felt each of these words as if she were being punched in the stomach. Jennifer's hatred, prejudice, and lack of knowledge were so great that there was no chance of conversation or understanding. But Susan also knew that underneath the veneer of superiority, Jennifer had a fear that made no sense. So Susan didn't want to be the target of that fear. Susan's anger grew so strong that she could no longer control it. She moved towards Jennifer and took a firm hold of the woman's neat hair. The action happened quickly and without warning. It took Jennifer by surprise. Susan was angrily pulling her hair. Jennifer screamed, trying to free herself. "You're not going to ruin my life, or my son's, with your lies and your despicable racism," Susan screamed. She was very sad and angry. Jennifer, very nervous, started fighting with Susan. She pulled on Susan's arms and tried to get out of her grip. At that moment, the door to the house burst open, and Dennis, Jennifer's husband, burst in. When he saw his wife being attacked, he didn't think twice. He threw a strong kick and hit Susan. She stumbled backwards and fell to the ground from the impact. Susan got up quickly and looked straight at Dennis. Her body was in pain, but her anger was stronger. She watched as Dennis pulled a gun from his waistband and pointed it in her direction. Susan wasted no time and reached for her gun. She still had that gun from her time at the FBI. The two looked at each other angrily, holding their guns. It was a soundless duel, full of tension and danger. No one moved. Time seemed to stand still. Jennifer was on the ground, out of breath. Susan and Dennis looked at each other, ready to act at any moment. "You should have thought twice before messing with us," said Dennis in a strong voice. "This isn't going to end well for you, Susan. You got involved with people you shouldn't have." Susan didn't back down. "I'm not afraid of you, Dennis. This story isn't going to end the way you imagine. You think you can hurt me and my son, but that's not going to happen." Her hand shook a little, but her eyes were steady. She realized that she was close to something very risky, but she also understood that she couldn't turn back. For a long time, the atmosphere was full of tension, but no one fired a shot. They both understood that the first shot would change everything forever. After a few seconds that seemed too long, Dennis slowly lowered the gun and took a step back. "You'll regret getting involved with us, Susan," he said, his gaze full of danger. Susan made no reply. She put the gun back in her waistband and took one last look at Jennifer. She was now getting up from the floor with her husband's help. "You accused me of racism, and you will suffer the consequences," Susan said calmly, before turning and walking away. The fight with Jennifer wasn't over yet, but Susan already knew what she was going to do next. She wasn't just fighting for justice. She was fighting to live in a world where hatred and prejudice were still trying to end lives like hers. Susan was not someone who decided things without thinking. Her whole life in the FBI had prepared her for moments like this. She understood how to think in a planned way. She knew how to use the right tools, and above all, she knew how to stay ahead of her adversaries. She was sitting at the kitchen table. Her mind started thinking very quickly. The fight between Jennifer and Dennis hadn't been enough for them to realize that they had crossed the line. Now Susan understood that she needed to use what she knew, and the people she knew to show the truth about the couple once and for all. She knew exactly where to start. The first piece in the game would be Dennis. Susan had heard rumors about him ever since she arrived in the neighborhood. Dennis was a man who wanted to show that he was strong and important, but he kept secrets. Susan knew that, as a former FBI agent, she could tap into some important data. With the right contacts, she could investigate further. Susan picked up the phone and made a call to a longtime friend, a companion from her days in the FBI. He had risen through the ranks. Now he had a leadership position. They always had a good relationship of trust. The phone rang a few times until a familiar voice answered on the other end. "Susan, I haven't heard from you for a long time." "How are you?" said the friendly voice of Robert, her ex-partner. Susan took a deep breath, relieved to hear a voice that was sympathetic. "Not too well, Robert." "Of course. I'm here to help. What do you need?" "There's a serious situation going on here, and I think you can help me catch the people who want to end my life." Robert, who always worries about Susan, was quiet for a moment before he spoke. "Tell me what's going on." You know that if I can, I'll do whatever I can. Susan told him everything. She talked about when Jennifer arrived in the neighborhood. She also explained that the complaint was a lie. Susan said that Tyler had been arrested. Finally, she talked about the fight she had with Dennis. Robert listened carefully. He didn't speak and paid attention to every detail. When Susan stopped talking, Robert realized that this was not normal. You want me to look into Jennifer and Dennis, is that it? Yes, Susan said instantly. I think there's something very strange about them. Jennifer isn't just a neighbor who has the wrong ideas. She's hiding something. And Dennis? Well, he's not exactly the perfect person he tries to show. Robert accepted. I'll try to find out what I can about them. I already have some tools that can help us find out who they really are. He paused for a moment before continuing. His voice became more serious. He said, But Susan, you know that when I start this investigation, things may come out that you may not want to know. Are you ready for that? Susan had no doubt. I'm ready for anything, Robert. They had messed with the person they shouldn't have. I want justice. So the conversation ended, and Robert began his investigation. Susan knew that Robert would soon find something. Time seemed to be running out. Every minute brought anxiety. But Susan knew it was only a matter of time before her enemies walked into the very trap they had set. A few days later, Robert returned with information that was better than Susan had expected. Susan, Robert said in a serious voice, you were right. Jennifer and Dennis are not the people they say they are. They come from Romania. As far as I know, they entered the United States without authorization, using false documents. That would be enough to send them away. But there's more. Susan's heart raced when she heard this. Robert said that Dennis also participates in some things that are wrong. I've been told that he has connections to a plan to hide money using companies that don't exist. His name was mentioned in many old investigations, but somehow he always managed to get away with it. He seems to be good at hiding his tracks, but now we have proof. Susan listened to everything and felt happy inside. Jennifer and Dennis were doing much more serious things than she had thought. It wasn't just racism, prejudice, and physical aggression. They were really living a lie. They hid their pasts and took advantage of the wrong things. Susan knew that this was the secret to beating them once and for all. Robert, this is exactly what I wanted, Susan said decisively. Right now, it's time to take action. I'm not going to let them keep destroying lives with their lies. In the days that followed, Susan carefully planned what she would do next. With the information Robert had gathered, she filed an official complaint. She handed over everything she had discovered to the police and also to the immigration authorities. She didn't just want Jennifer and Dennis to be punished for racism. She also wanted them to pay for all the lies and crimes they were hiding. And this time, they couldn't run away. Finally, the day came. Police officers, immigration agents, and financial investigators came to Jennifer and Dennis's house. They were ready to arrest the couple. Jennifer, who always felt protected in her comfortable world, was surprised. Dennis, who always acts arrogantly, tried not to accept it, but the evidence was clear, and there was no doubt. Not only would they have to deal with deportation, but they would also face legal action for federal crimes. Susan watched from afar as everything unfolded. Her revenge wasn't just for the pain they had caused her and Tyler. It was also about justice finally appearing. Jennifer and Dennis, who had lived in hiding with lies and manipulation, were now in plain sight and could no longer get away with it. Susan knew that the fight for justice wasn't over yet. But that achievement was the first step towards bringing back the peace they had tried to take away from them. When the police took Jennifer and Dennis away, Susan closed her eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. But deportation wasn't the only thing that mattered to Susan. She understood that just seeing Jennifer and Dennis leave the United States wouldn't be enough. Susan wanted them to be punished fairly for everything they had done. This was not only for her sake, but also for all the people they had hurt over the years. Their connection to the money laundering scheme made this possible. Just then, one of the agents walked up to Susan. He was a tall man with a strong gaze. He had helped with Robert's investigations. Miss Susan, he said in a serious but respectful voice, Jennifer and Dennis are going to be sent back to Romania, as you requested. Before that, they will have to deal with official charges for crimes that took place here in the United States. They received a 5-year prison sentence. The Romanian government has already said that they will carry out this sentence after they are sent back. Susan nodded slowly, thinking about what she had heard. This was exactly what she wanted. For Jennifer and Dennis not only to be sent out of the country, but also to pay for what they had done wrong. That's what they deserve, she said softly, with a small, happy smile on her face. As Jennifer made her way to the police car, she looked into Susan's eyes for a moment. In his gaze there was hatred and despair, but there was also something else. He knew that his life, which had seemed perfect and controlled, had fallen apart. Jennifer, the woman who had always felt powerful because of her status and money, was now facing a situation she never thought would happen to her. She was no longer untouched. Her power, her arrogant manner, and her prejudices, none of it could protect her. Susan won. Dennis didn't look at Susan. His anger, which had been clear in the fight, seemed to have changed to quiet acceptance. He understood that he could no longer run away. The evidence against him was strong, and he was going to be convicted. Dennis had always been the kind of man who prided himself on being invulnerable. But now, handcuffed and about to be sent back, he was just another thug being brought to justice. The police cars slowly pulled out of the street. The sirens were off, but the lights continued to flash nonstop. Susan stayed where she was. She watched until the last car was out of sight. The neighborhood was quiet, almost because of the magnitude of what had just happened. Susan took a deep breath. She felt the cool night air enter her chest. The relief was there, but it came with a sad thought. Even if Jennifer and Dennis were no longer part of her life, the marks that all this had left would never completely disappear. Susan entered the house. She was relieved, but not completely. She understood that Jennifer and Dennis's deportation and imprisonment were only part of the picture. Tyler was still in prison. Even with the evidence that showed he was innocent, the fight to get him released would not be simple. Susan understood that there were still many problems ahead. But that moment when justice was done to Jennifer and Dennis gave her the energy she needed to keep going. That evening, as she sat in the kitchen, Susan sipped her tea and thought about everything that had happened. She wasn't the type to seek revenge. However, at that moment, revenge and justice mixed. Jennifer and Dennis, with their arrogant and cruel attitude, had tried to end her life, but they had been defeated. Susan had regained her power, her voice, and above all, her dignity. Now she would look at Tyler. Susan sat down again. She felt the weight of reality on her shoulders. The victory she had achieved was important, but it was only one part of a greater whole. Until Tyler is free, and until the system that imprisoned him is challenged, she won't be able to feel the true joy of having won. Jennifer and Dennis had lost, but the real enemy, who had let prejudice and injustice take over, was still there, untouched. It was then that Susan decided something. Tyler's quest for freedom would be his next task. She needed to stand up to the system that had wrongly imprisoned her son. She would use all her resources and all her experience to show where the mistakes were that led to his imprisonment. He knew the fight would be long and difficult, but the will inside him was very strong. She hadn't come this far to stop now. Susan took out her cell phone and started calling people. The first was Robert, who was her friend at the FBI. He had helped her arrest Jennifer and Dennis. "Robert," she said with certainty, "Tyler is still in jail, and that needs to change. I'm going to find all the people who are responsible. I won't rest until he's free." Robert listened in silence before saying, "You know it's not going to be easy, Susan. But I'm on your side. We'll show you everything that has to do with this." Susan put the phone down and looked back at Jennifer's dark house. The fight that had begun as a quarrel between neighbors who were racist had now turned into something more significant. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice. It was about correcting a system that let people like Jennifer and Dennis use lies and prejudice to end the lives of others. Susan had a bad taste for revenge, but now she understood that she could change it for the better. Her task, her new fight, would be to free Tyler and make sure that nothing that happened to them ever happened again to other families. Revenge became a new goal. With this new goal, Susan knew she was ready to face any difficulty that came her way. Until her son was released, she devoted her strength to a house called Roger. Susan still hadn't found the tranquility she so desperately wanted. Even with Jennifer and Dennis being sent out of the country and dealing with problems because of their crimes, there was one constant worry that still plagued her: Police Officer Roger. After Susan made Jennifer and Dennis fall, She looked all at Roger. He was the person who had broken into her house. He was the one who commanded the entry, putting handcuffs on her and taking her son to prison on the basis of falsehoods. Susan knew that Roger wasn't the kind of policeman who just obeyed orders. He seemed to enjoy using his power to abuse others. Susan, having worked in the FBI, knew that men like him didn't do things alone. She started looking for information about Roger on her own. However, she knew that she needed more than just her own feelings and knowledge to prove that he was a fake. Once again, he asked his old FBI friend Robert for help. Robert's help was very important in arresting Jennifer and Dennis. Susan called Robert's number. She felt her heart racing. If there was something wrong with Roger's actions, she knew Robert would be able to find out. "Hi, Susan. How are you?" Robert's voice was calm, but she could see the concern. He knew that, for Susan, the dispute wasn't over until all the parties were in the right places. "I'm fine, Robert, but I need you to help me again." "Roger. The policeman who broke into my house. There's something very strange about him, and I can't ignore it. I want to know everything about him." Robert paused for a moment before answering. "Susan, you know that researching a policeman can be difficult. One more like Roger, who seems to have connections with the force. However, I trust his feeling. If you think there's something there, I'll check it out." Susan realized that there was something wrong hidden behind Roger's appearance. She felt it. Over the next few days, Robert began to dig deep into the policeman's life, and what he discovered was much worse than Susan had thought. "Susanna," Robert said when she called a few days later, his voice very serious, "you were right about Roger. This man has a lot of hidden problems. He has a history of investigations that have been kept under wraps. All these investigations were about abuses of power and aggression, especially against women." Susan felt her stomach turn funny. That explained how Roger acted when they broke into his house. He wasn't just a policeman who did what he was told. He was a person who used his badge to scare, hurt, and take advantage of his position. And worst of all, he had been doing this for years and had never been punished. "Besides," continued Robert, "I found something more serious. Roger has links to a group of criminals in the area. He earned money by offering favors. He did this to hide investigations and help with wrongdoing. He mainly used his power to defend crooks." Susan held the phone tightly. She felt the anger rising inside her. Roger wasn't just a dishonest policeman. He was a crook who hid inside the system. He used his power to make money and cause trouble. And somehow, this man managed to evade justice all this time. "How did he manage to escape for so long?" Susan asked, already knowing the answer. "He was looking after someone inside the building," Robert replied. "A rogue deputy who caused all the investigations against Roger to be stopped. They had worked together for many years." Susan now had all the pieces of the puzzle. Roger wasn't just a violent policeman. He was linked to a corrupt group that included other police officers. Susan knew that if she wanted to take him down, she had to do it quickly and carefully. She couldn't give Roger or his friends the chance to hide or to destroy the evidence. "Robert, I want all of this to come out," Susan said with determination. "I want Roger and all the people who are involved to be shown up and for them to face justice. I won't stop fighting until he's in jail." Robert agreed. "I'm going to send all the information I found to Internal Affairs and the FBI. We're going to put pressure on the authorities to investigate again. This time, we want him to suffer the consequences of everything he's done." With the evidence she had, and Robert's help, Susan knew she was in an advantageous position. She saw when Roger's case was officially reopened. Soon, the news began to appear in the local media. Police officer linked to corruption and abuse of power appeared on the front pages of newspapers. Roger's name, which had previously been respected by some people, was now associated with a scandal. The investigations moved quickly. People came forward to tell bad stories of Roger's abuse. They were women who had been assaulted by him. There were also small traders who had suffered threats and extortion. Each new detail that emerged showed a worse picture of who he really was. Susan, watching everything unfold, felt that the truth was finally coming out. Roger was quickly arrested. The image of the man who had burst into her house, shouting at her and treating her badly, now arrested and being taken away by the very police he had controlled, was one of the happiest victories Susan had ever had. He was no longer the strong officer who scared everyone. Now Roger was just a criminal, found out because of the things he'd done. In court, the place was very tense. The prosecutor, a woman with a strong, clear voice, stood up to begin her explanation. She said many things about Roger's sad past. For many years, the accused man used his badge to hide his wrongdoings. He misused his power. He scared, beat, and threatened people who were not to blame. He also hid crimes and took part in corrupt schemes with criminals in the region. Today, we are here to make sure that he deals with the consequences of his actions. Susan felt a shiver run up her spine as she heard those words. She knew that Roger was a dangerous man. However, hearing the prosecutor talk about his crimes brought out all the pain and fear she had been harboring. Roger wasn't just a policeman who did wrong things. He was a person who attacked others. He used his power to cause fear in people and always felt safe because of the system he himself had ruined. Susan knew that many people like her had suffered from Roger, but that day, the truth was going to be shown. As the prosecution began to show the evidence, it became clear that Roger's crimes were very serious. Robert, Susan's old friend from the FBI, had managed to gather a number of documents and testimonies that showed who the man who had hidden behind the law for so long really was. The saved investigations, the accounts of victims who, for fear of punishment, had never spoken out before, and the money movements that showed their connection to the crime. Everything was there, visible for all to see. Susan couldn't help feeling a little relief and sadness as she listened to the stories of other people who had suffered with Roger. One woman stood up to speak. Her voice was shaking and her eyes were full of tears. "Roger came into my house without permission," she said, trying to hold back the tears. "He scared me. He said that if I told anyone, he'd finish me off. I spent many years afraid. I always looked back. I thought he would come back to haunt me again. A man who sold things in the town said that Roger asked him for money to defend his store. When he didn't accept, his store was attacked several times. There was always the same hidden threat. This could get worse if you don't help." Susan felt her heart squeeze when she heard these stories. She was accompanied. Roger had created a visible pattern of violence and fear over the years. He had always escaped the consequences of his actions. When it was time for Roger to speak, everyone in the room was quiet. Everyone was nervous to hear what he would say, but to Susan's surprise, Roger was calm and thoughtful. He stood up calmly. He adjusted the collar of his prisoner's shirt as if he were still in control of the situation. When he began to speak, his voice was strong, but he didn't have the arrogance he had before. "I've worked for this city for many years," he said, looking at the court with disinterest. "I've done what I needed to do to maintain the organization. You who are sitting in your chairs don't know what it's like to be on the streets, dealing with criminals every day. I did what had to be done. If that means that some rules were broken, fine. Because in the end, I defended this city." Susan felt very angry. Even with plenty of evidence to the contrary, Roger still thought he was the hero of his own story. He couldn't or wouldn't see the sadness he had caused in people's lives. He thought that somehow he was above the rules, that what he did was right because he carried the badge. The prosecutor acted quickly to end her defense. "Mr. Roger, this isn't just about controlling things. The text talks about abuse of power. It talks about using the badge, which should symbolize justice, to do wrong things and commit crimes. You weren't looking after the city. You were frightening people and making money out of their suffering. So the decision was given." Roger received a 10-year prison sentence. Many people thought this punishment was small in relation to the damage he had done. However, for Susan and the other people who suffered, seeing Roger punished now, seeing a man who for a long time thought he was more important than the law being sent to prison, is a strong symbol of justice. Susan saw Roger being led out of the courtroom. He looked like a beaten man. He was no longer the officer who entered his house with arrogance and disdain. He was just another thug, punished for his actions. Susan's feeling of wanting revenge didn't make her sad this time. It brought a sense of relief. Roger was in jail, and justice, however long it took, had been done. Susan left the courtroom feeling calmer. She took a deep breath of the morning air. She knew she still had a lot to do to free Tyler, but Roger's fall was an important step along the way. Susan's relief at seeing Roger convicted and sent to prison was short-lived. She understood that, even with that chapter over, The biggest fight was still to come. Her son, Tyler, was still in prison. He had been wrongly accused because of a lie told by Jennifer. Susan often visited Tyler in jail. Every time he saw her, her heart grew tighter. He was her only son. Seeing him in that orange uniform, sitting on the other side of the cold glass in the visiting room, was a pain that no mother should have to go through. Tyler always tried to look strong, but Susan could see the sadness and anger in his eyes. He was in jail for a crime he didn't do. He was the victim of a system that couldn't help him. The weeks went by, and Tyler remained in prison while Susan tried to get him out. But evil fate had one more surprise that Susan never imagined. One evening, while Susan was at home, the phone rang. It was a normal sound, but what was about to happen was very different. She answered, thinking it was an update on Tyler's case. However, the voice on the other end of the line was cold and sounded official. She felt it was urgent. "Ms. Susan," the voice began, "I'm the warden of the prison where your son is being held. I have some news about Tyler, and I don't think it's good." Susan felt the ground disappear from under her feet. Her body stiffened, and for a moment she couldn't speak. "What happened to my son?" Her voice came out weak and shaky, showing fear and surprise. "This afternoon there was a riot in the jail," said the warden, pausing for what seemed like an awkward moment. "During the commotion, his son Tyler was assaulted. The person who carried out that attack was ex-policeman Roger." Susan felt as if everything around her was falling apart. How could Roger, the man she had just beaten in court, still hurt her son? Was he stuck in the same place as Tyler? She never knew that. The prison was large, and the chances of them meeting were very slim. But now, what seemed impossible had happened. The warden continued. His voice was serious, but it didn't have the warmth that Susan wanted to hear. "Roger hit his son with an iron bar in the middle of the confusion. Tyler is badly injured and has been taken to hospital. He's in a coma, Mrs. Susan. The doctors are doing everything they can, but his condition is very serious." The word coma hit Susan hard in the head, like a loud, senseless noise. The world around her seemed to fall away as she tried to understand the seriousness of what she had just heard. Tyler, her son, whom she had always tried to save, was now in danger, between life and death. He was the victim of a revenge she had never imagined could happen. The air in the room was thin, and Susan had to lean on the table to keep from falling over. She felt that everything she had done to look after Tyler and bring him home had been to no avail. Roger, even though he was in prison, had managed to take his revenge in a very cruel and destructive way. Susan knew that he understood how important Tyler was to her. And he, in a very violent last act, decided to attack what was most important to Susan. This left a mark of pain and suffering on her life. Susan put the phone down. She stood still for a while, not moving, worried about what had happened. It seemed that fate was playing tricks on her. It gave small victories and then brought new sorrows. She had beaten Roger in court, but he had found a way to hurt her emotionally. Susan felt a mixture of anger and despair. She, who had always been so strong and determined, for the first time felt very weak. She grabbed her car keys. Then she drove to the hospital. The road looked like a blur. The city lights flashed past her eyes, but she didn't notice. All she could think about was Tyler. She thought about how he had fought to prove that he was innocent. She thought about how he didn't deserve to go through this. She arrived at the hospital and a doctor greeted her. The doctor took her to the ICU. When she finally saw her son, lying in bed, with tubes attached to him, and his face very pale, something inside her broke. Susan approached Tyler slowly. With each step it seemed that his foot was heavier than the last. She sat down next to him. She held her son's hand, which was cold. Quiet tears streamed down Susan's face as she watched Tyler. He looked very weak and unprotected, unlike the strong, determined man she knew. All this had happened because of a series of injustices that began with a lie about race and ended with a very cruel revenge. Susan stayed there, close to Tyler, for many hours. The machines around her made non-stop noises, but all she could hear were the prison warden's words repeating in her head. Her son was in a very serious condition, and the doctors couldn't say whether he would wake up. The pain Susan felt was very strong. It was like a hole that seemed to take all her energy. She had fought hard to get justice and protect her family. But now, all she had was a hospital bed and doubt about a future she couldn't control. Susan knew she had to find the strength to keep fighting. But at that moment, all she could do was hold Tyler's hand and wait. To hope that he would try to come back, that he would fight as he always had, that he would somehow get through this sadness. The taste of Roger winning now seemed sad and far away. Susan felt cheated by life. Justice happened in court, but life, with its difficult surprises, found a way to turn it into another nightmare. The choice to take revenge seemed normal to Susan. After everything Roger, Jennifer, and Dennis had done, the desire to see them pay for their mistakes was too strong. Susan thought that taking revenge was a way of putting things right and putting things right. She fought hard to defeat her enemies. Each small victory was a step towards what she thought was justice. Now that Tyler was so fragile, she wondered if all this had really brought her the peace she wanted. Susan looked at Tyler and saw, on the face she loved so much, the signs of her own battle. Her son was there because of the struggle she had decided to face. Even though he was affected by the situations, Tyler had to face the biggest consequence. Susan was always feeling guilty. It was like a shadow that followed her. She heard a voice that made her think about every decision she made. Could it be that by trying to protect her son, she was putting him at even greater risk? Susan felt a new emotion called guilt. She, who had always been very strong and sure of her choices, was now wondering about her own direction. Every victory against Roger and Jennifer, which had once seemed good, now tasted bad. Victory was mixed with sadness. Susan realized that, at some point, she had lost something that was important. She had lost the clarity that had helped her before. That belief that it was possible to achieve justice without destroying her own soul along the way was gone. The anger still burned inside her. A part of Susan wanted very much to continue seeking revenge. She wanted to put an end to everything and everyone who had done her so much harm. Roger, even in prison, was still in her thoughts, like a wound that won't heal. He had hurt Tyler in a way that might never heal. Susan knew she could use every means she had to make him suffer more, to make him pay for everything he had done. But while this idea gave her a sense of power for a while, it also made her tired. She began to realize that if she went down this path, revenge would take over everything. Not only your peace of mind inside, but also your future with Tyler. Susan knew that even if Roger paid for his mistakes, nothing would make up for lost time. Tyler's pain and his struggle to live would continue. What she wanted most, apart from revenge, was to see her son wake up, hear his voice, and feel that he was with her. That was what was important right now. Forgiveness is important. It helps to heal hurts and release bad feelings. When we forgive, we can live better. Forgiveness is an act of love and understanding. It brings peace to those who forgive and those who are forgiven. This idea was complicated for Susan. Forgiveness seemed delicate, something she didn't usually offer. For Susan, forgiveness had always been a sign of weakness. She thought that strong people didn't need to think about it. But at the same time, she was beginning to see forgiveness in a different light, as a strong and courageous attitude. Letting go of hatred wasn't being weak. It was a way of feeling free. That way, the people she disliked couldn't control her life and her heart. After several days of thinking and struggling within herself, Susan made a choice that would even surprise her. She knew she had to think about forgiving. But the pain of seeing her son in a coma because of Roger was too great. Roger was not a normal man. He was a thief who dressed up as a policeman. He had ended the lives of many people, and he didn't feel bad about it. Even in prison, he found a way to hurt Susan more by assaulting Tyler. Something had to be done to prevent him from hurting anyone else. The system had failed him once, and Susan couldn't trust him to stay in prison for long. She understood that ordinary justice wouldn't be enough. Roger had strong friends who always stood up for him. That way, he could avoid serious problems. Susan, having worked for the FBI for many years, understood how the justice system worked. She knew that men like him always managed to use the law to their advantage. Susan decided she was going to do something very different. She made a hidden plan to take Roger's life, but in a way that would leave no evidence. There would be no death, no blood, just a way to make sure he never hurt anyone again. She thought it would be good to send him somewhere where no one could find him. She knew just where. In Siberia, which is one of the most difficult and remote areas of the world to live in. There, Roger would be left alone. He would have to face the cold and the loneliness. In the end, he would feel unimportant in his own life. Susan had the right people to make this plan happen. During her time at the FBI, she made friends with agents from all over the world. Some of them are now retired, but still manage to help out in important places. Did you know that, with the right help, you could make Roger disappear without leaving a trace? She began to organize her work very carefully. First, he spoke to an old friend, Alexei, who had been a Russian agent and now worked privately in a private security job. Alexei owed Susan a debt because she had done something for him in the past. When she went to talk to him, he realized it was time to return the favor. Alexei, I need you to help me with a very specific task. Roger, a man who ended my life and almost harmed my son, needs to be put away. I don't want him to die, but I need him gone. Constantly. Alexei, on the other end of the phone, was quiet for a few moments. He understood that Susan never spoke superficially. If she was asking for something like this, it was because the situation was very serious. Do you want him to go away? He asked the question thoughtfully. Yes, said Susan with certainty. I want him to go somewhere where he can't hurt anyone else. I thought of Siberia, somewhere far away, where he'll be just another man lost in the cold. Alexei let out a quick laugh, but it wasn't funny. Siberia is very big, cold, and has many places where people like him can disappear. If that's what you want, I can help. But you need to know, he will never come back. He'll be alone. That's what I want, Susan replied coldly. He can't boss people around anymore. Susan worked out the plan in detail with Alexei's help. The task would require care and secrecy. Roger was going to get out of prison without anyone seeing. Susan knew that Roger still had people in the police who didn't like him. These people were tired of his corruption. They would ignore his strange transfer. Susan and Alexei organized the transport. They planned a secret flight that would take Roger to Russia. Then he would be taken to one of the most remote areas of Siberia. On the night of the action, everything was ready. Susan was calm, serene, and thoughtful. As he watched the plan unfold, he felt a mixture of joy and that it was the right thing to do. For her, this wasn't just about getting revenge. It was a way of protecting herself in the future. Roger, who had always known how to control the system, was about to be taken out of the game for good. Alexei's cronies, who were dressed as prison guards, managed to catch Roger without anyone getting suspicious. He was given sedatives and put in a car. This car took him to an airplane that we didn't know what it was. Susan didn't want to be there when the capture took place. She decided to leave it to Alexei and his team, who had experience in carrying out operations like this. What was important to her was that Roger was going far, far away. The plane left that night. It crossed the ocean and landed on a secret runway in Russia. After that, Alexei and his team walked for many kilometers to an empty area of Siberia. There, in an isolated place, Roger was left alone with few items. He had water, enough food for a few days, and clothes for the cold. No communication of any kind. There is no way back. When he wakes up, he will be totally alone. He will be surrounded only by the intense cold and the endless silence of the ice plains. Susan didn't think Roger would live in that place for long. He was a man who used to use power and fear to get by. But in that place, in the center of Siberia, none of that would make any difference. He would be just another man trying to cope with nature. He would have no friends, no allies, and no chance of saving himself. Susan didn't want to see a way out, and that was that. When Susan heard that Alexei's operation had worked, she had a quick moment of relief. Roger was no longer in the world. He was gone forever. He could no longer make anyone suffer. She would no longer have to look back or be afraid for her son. The world was finally free of an animal that hunted others. Susan, however, knew that the decision she had made was not easy to bear. She didn't feel guilty about what she had done. However, the choice to walk away from ordinary justice and plan such a difficult exile was not something anyone could bear. But for Susan, it was a price worth paying. Roger managed to avoid all the punishments of the law, but in the empty lands of Siberia, he would have to face the real judgment. That judgment would be of nature itself and the eternal silence of his new prison. After Roger left her life, Susan returned to the hospital. After many days of waiting, praying, and being attentive at her son's side, Susan finally noticed a movement, almost invisible on Tyler's face. Susan stopped breathing, unable to believe what she was seeing. That moment, which she had been waiting for, had finally happened. "Tyler," she said softly, trying to hold back the tears that were soon streaming down her face. "My son, you're awake." Her voice was calm. It had a way of bringing relief and a very strong love. Tyler quickly closed his eyes. They were still tired from the pain and confusion. He seemed lost. He tried to understand where he was and what had happened. But when he looked at his mother, he saw the smile and happiness on her face. He tried to talk, but his throat was dry. The weakness in his body made it difficult to move. Still, a small smile appeared on his face. Susan picked up a glass of water. "Don't worry," she said, her voice still shaking with emotion. "You're in hospital, my son. You were in a coma, but now you're here, with me." Tyler's eyes seemed to want to know more than he could say at that moment. Susan knew he would ask a lot of questions. He couldn't remember all the details, but he knew that something very bad had happened. The last memory he had was of the riot in jail. He remembered the violent attack he received from Roger, and then everything will be empty. After a few moments of silence, while Tyler tried to adapt to the new situation, he managed to say a few words. "Roger, he assaulted me, right?" Susan felt a pain when she heard Roger's name again. She knew that ghost was still there with them, but now was the time to put an end to him once and for all. She held Tyler's hand tightly. She looked into her son's eyes and in a quiet but determined voice said, "Yes, Roger hurt you, but you feel safe now. He won't hurt you again." "No way." Tyler grimaced, trying to understand what that meant. "What happened to him, Mom?" he asked in a low voice, but he was very curious. He knew his mother well. She wasn't the type to let things happen without doing anything. He had learned over the years that Susan always managed to take care of her family. Susan took a deep breath. She knew it was time to tell her son what she had done. She moved a little closer to Tyler, as if the words she was about to say were their own secret. "Roger is gone, Tyler. He's been sent out of the country. He'll never come back. He'll never hurt anyone. He's in a place where he can no longer use his power to hurt anyone." Tyler quickly closed and opened his eyes, impressed. He knew how strong his mother was, but this news was much more than he thought. "What do you mean by the word exiled?" he asked, while still thinking about the idea. Susan took his hand slowly. She gave him a calm but confident smile. "I did what had to be done to make sure he couldn't come back, Tyler. He was taken to Siberia. It's far away and it's lonely. He left our lives never to return. No one will ever find him. The fights are over.